Thank you, Mr Speaker. Kia ora koutou. Mr Speaker, the first look at this bill brought on a bit of a case of Groundhog Day. This, to my count, is something like the fifth or sixth piece of legislation that we've seen in recent years with this heading of prisoners and victims, unfortunately none of which have really generated better outcomes than we might otherwise have had. We believe this House is once again devoting its very expensive time and its resource to what is essentially, and has been from day one, an ill-conceived piece of legislation. We're now seeking to extend the life of this legislation, despite the evidence, the quantitative and qualitative evidence, that it has done very little good over the intervening 7 or 8 years, and in fact has considerable potential to do harm. The purpose, the intention of this original piece of legislation was to return to compensate victims of crimes, to ensure that if the perpetrators of crime came upon a windfall or some return as a result of claims against the Crown, that victims would be compensated. I would hazard a guess, sir, that the amount of money that has been returned to victims as a result of this legislation is significantly less than the cost has been associated with the initial primary legislation and the numerous amendments to it. It has been a hopelessly ineffective piece of legislation, and we think it ought to end now. In the 2010 debate that brought us to this 2012 deadline, which I remind the House was conducted under urgency some nearly 2 years ago, I asked the question of the then Minister what actual sums of money had been returned to victims, how many people had directly benefited as a result of this legislation. And the answer, to his credit, the Minister in the committee stage gave us the answer and told us that a total of $25,000 had been awarded to victims as reparations. A total of 4 victims had received a total sum of $38,000 collectively. So, in fact, the first 5 years of this Act returned $65,000 in total, a drop in anybody's bucket. It has not been effective. That is an extraordinarily small amount of money, and I suspect there's been very little added to it in the 18 months or 2 years just gone by. The Minister, in a presentation of this bill, stressed the importance of getting us through the House quickly, gave us effectively a deadline at Select Committee of June 11th. She's concerned that otherwise a window will open that will enable, presumably that would enable prisoners to enjoy the, a bee in the House, that's the first, that would allow victims to enjoy the benefit of any reparations they were paid. I remind the Minister, this bill only really kicks in if prisoners are abused and while they're in the care and custody of the state. The easy way to ensure there are no further opportunities for prisoners to benefit, presumably, to ensure that there is no abuse of prisoners while they're in the custody of the state. The Greens opposed this bill, as it was then the Prisoners and Victims Claims Bill, prior to 2005, because we saw then it would lead to a reduction in the respect for human rights. We said at the time it was likely to be ineffectual, and this is now proven to be the case. It had very few redeeming features at the time. We did support the bill. We were persuaded at the time to support the primary legislation that we're seeking to amend. And we did that on a promise that there would be a major reassessment, a significant review, a complete overhaul of all legislation, that some real attention would be paid to assuring victims' rights, to putting in place some structural procedures and elements that would ensure that people who suffer crime or the victims of crimes are properly compensated and recognised. Sadly, that has not occurred over time. Instead, we're continuing to perpetuate this piece of legislation that is a classic example of a government, in fact 2 governments, pretending to do something, creating the illusion, the artifice of doing something positive for victims, and in fact doing very little at all. This is a very convoluted piece of primary legislation. Effectively, the Act denies prisoners the possibility of redress for wrongs done. The only way that victims of crime can benefit through this is if there is further, if a prisoner or an inmate under the control of the state either has a windfall or more likely gets some recompense for their rights being abused. It is a very peculiar, it's a very perverse model, and we would be better to simply remove it from the books, and let's have a little bit of confidence in the Corrections Department in 2012 that they will not create situations that will enable prisoners to make claims of having been abused that a court would see merit in, that would enable them to have some reparation paid to them. Recall the genesis of this bill, the so-called behaviour management regime that was occurring at, the genesis of the primary legislation that this bill amends. Inmates were suffering abuse tantamount to torture under the so-called behaviour management regime at Mount Eden Prison. One concedes there were serious high-end offenders, they were not nice people, but the state nevertheless has an absolute responsibility to respect the basic human rights of people who are in custody, even offenders, even prisoners. They remain humans, they remain citizens of this country, they are entitled to the protection of their human rights. At the time that the primary legislation was passed, a now departed member of this House, to his discredit, referred to payments made under legal claims against the BMR, that this was effectively a golden handshake for inmates. That is so far from the truth. That set us on this very long-winded path with multiple amendments that's brought us to this situation now. This Act has not worked for victims, it has not worked for prisoners, and we should simply let it fall and, as I said, trust corrections not to get it wrong. There are so many things we could be doing to change the corrections regime, the way we deal with offenders, the way we deal with victims, the way we manage our prisoners and our prisoners. There is currently a piece of legislation, a Corrections Amendment Act, before this House that does have some positive features. It does propose some efficiencies in practice, some administrative tweaks to management, but it also unfortunately contains some major steps towards further abuse of human rights, further denials of basic human rights, and will remove us even further from our national, our legal, and indeed our international obligations. It's worth recalling that when the primary legislation was put in place, it was many of the NGOs, the organisations dedicated to protecting human rights, that opposed the legislation, perhaps surprisingly, but they saw through it. They understood very well that what was called for was not some grandstanding piece of legislation that appeared to be producing some benefits, some results for victims, but a serious, ground-up, community-led, I'd suggest, assessment of what is needed to do the best by the victims of crimes, and indeed how best can we ensure that we reduce the number of victims of crime. It is clear that over the past decade or more there was a struggle between the two main parties. There was a battle. Neither was willing to concede an inch. There was this fear of being seen to be soft on crime, allegedly responding to a sense within New Zealand society that we wanted to punish people who offended. Actually, there is very little evidence that New Zealand is a punitive society. There were some TV polls done in 2006 that indicated a preference for community-based sentences. Colin James, who is not known as one of the more wide-eyed radical commentators or journalists in New Zealand, commented recently that a number of organisations have perceived a much more broad-based interest in looking for alternatives to prison, looking for alternatives to incarceration, looking for alternatives to the so-called tough-on-crime approach. Last night I was pleased to be at the launch of Just Speak, a group of young people who are committed to doing better, to seeing improvements in our corrections regimes, particularly in our management of victims and our management of offenders. We can do a great deal better than this. By perpetuating this bill for another 12 months, we are simply perpetuating a failed model, a flawed model, of an approach that we know is incredibly expensive at a time when we are stretched financially. It hasn't worked, it won't work, and the Greens will continue to oppose it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Dr. Cam Calder.
Mr. Speaker.